Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Hudson Library for our virtual art history program in collaboration with the Museum of Arts and Sciences in Daytona Beach, Florida. They are joining us for a talk this morning on the naturalist and artist John James Audubon. Before I introduce our speaker today, let me just take a minute and mention some of our upcoming programs here at the library. We do have a lot coming up. The month of March, we are doing, our adult services department is doing World War II month. So we've had a lot of programs already, but we still have many coming up. Tomorrow morning, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans is doing a virtual presentation on what comes next 5 years after the war. Thursday morning, we have the Smithsonian is doing a program on the Victory Gardens during World War II. That one's also virtual. Thursday evening, we have Professor Elise Graham is going to be speaking about her book, Book and Dagger, How Scholars and Librarians Became Unlikely Spies of World War II. Saturday, we have New York Times bestselling author Caroline Moorhead. She's written a book, A House in the Mountains, The Women Who Liberated Italy from Fascism. And next week we have, if you're here for art history, you might enjoy this one as well. Next week, the Cleveland Museum of Art is doing a presentation on the Monuments Men, the Cleveland Connection. So you can take a look at the library's website at hudsonlibrary.org and take a look at all of our upcoming programs. Some are virtual, some are in person. So just make note of it when you're registering. Let me introduce our author or our speaker this morning. Joining us is Senior Curator of Education and Curator of History, Zach Zacharias. And he's joining us today for some highlights of the museum's collection of Audubon prints. The C.C. and Hyatt Brown's collection of original Audubon prints given as a transformational gift to the Museum of Arts and Sciences makes this collection one of the finest in the country. So we're very excited to have you with us today, Zach.
Thank you.
Yeah, Zach has been with the Museum of Arts and Sciences for over 25 years and is the Senior Curator of Education and Curator of History with a specialty in Florida history, art, and paleontology. He has also written for the Smithsonian blog and published quarterly in the Arts and Sciences magazine. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
How's the weather in Daytona Beach today?
So I will tell you, it's a little chilly this morning for here. It was about 47 degrees, but it will
Wow,
warm up to about 80 degrees today.
nice.
So, it's been chilly in the mornings for us. For us, you would need a jacket but it warms up really nice and it's a very clear, sunny day. But it's been
Nice.
a pretty chilly spring and a chilly winter for the most part for us.
Mhm.
Of course, we had all that snow in Tallahassee and North Florida, like 8, 9 inches. So that was pretty weird.
Wow.
Yeah, Tallahassee, and some parts north of Tallahassee got 10 inches of snow, which was
Wow.
amazing. So it was crazy. So it's been a little crazy. It didn't
Yeah.
It's winter down here. So, but I kind of like the cooler weather. I really, a lot of you've probably been to Florida, and if you've been in the summertime, it's pretty rough. So it can be really harsh. So, but thank goodness for air conditioning. They should have a monument to that person. All right, so are we ready to talk a little bit about John James Audubon? And I need to share my screen. Is that correct? So do I hit the share button? Is that right?
Yes.
All righty. Let me hit the share button. And there we go. And share. Okay, we go to the very beginning. And let's see here. Slideshow, play from the start. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, so Audubon, man, myth, and legend. A lot of people know of Audubon, but they might not know a lot about him. So he's a pretty well-known name, but a lot of people might know a lot about his biography, which we're going to talk a lot about today, which is what a lot of people study. You could spend multiple lifetimes studying Audubon and his life and the bird. So it's a great combination of art, science, and history all mixed into one. And so it's really pretty amazing story. He wasn't a perfect guy. He owned slaves, so he does have some controversy with him. And we do address that in our exhibit. So our exhibit is the largest exhibit of Audubon's ever in the history of the state of Florida. So it's a pretty amazing collection. And one thing that's interesting is that the donors, the CC and Hyatt Brown, that was mentioned earlier, they're big donors to the museum. Hyatt Brown owns Brown and Brown Insurance, which is the fifth largest insurance company in the world. And they've been collecting Florida art, and they've been collecting original prints of Audubon, which roughly he made 200 of those. So they're extremely rare. They've been collecting them for 20 years. They have agents and employees that help them, art historians that help them find what you would say grade A artifacts of Audubon, especially these prints. So they try to collect some that are like of the highest quality. They've donated all 92 of their prints to the Museum of Arts and Sciences in Daytona Beach, which now gives us one of the largest collections in the South, and actually a really large collection worldwide if you think about it. Not the largest, but it's pretty large. And that's that's like a $12 million donation. So it's very feather in the cap, if you want to say, no pun intended, for the museum to have that collection permanently. In our exhibit right now, we have about 72 that are on display. And we've worked on this exhibit for 2 years. It's got an audio guide. It's got a companion book and actually a guest curator, a gentleman named Clay Henderson, who was the president of the Florida Audubon Society for a long time. He's an environmental lawyer, was basically the curator, and we helped him along with this. When we talk about birds, we're really talking about dinosaurs. And there was a man named Huxley not long after Darwin's book came out, The Origin of Species, and um, he made his connection that birds may be the descendants of dinosaurs. But he was seen, this guy Huxley was really seen as a fool, and like nobody believed this. It's sort of like plate tectonics. Nobody believed that the continents moved either until the 1960s, and that scientist who first came up with that was kind of seen as outlandish. So it's really not until the 1980s that a guy named John Ostrom from Yale, paleontologist, great paleontologist, kind of rediscovered these connections, birds and its connection to dinosaurs, because bird evolution has been a long mystery. And we finally realized that when China opened up, there were new specimens coming out of China in the Gobi Desert. Uh, and we were realizing that we're finding these small theropod dinosaurs, like a velociraptor and microraptor and guanglong. Theropod dinosaurs walk, they're the bipedal meat eaters. And we realized finally through scientific inquiry and investigation and hypothesis and testing that these small theropod dinosaurs called the dromaeosaurs were having feathers, and they were having flight feathers. And these feathers were designed for flight. So the specimen you see on there is basically first bird or ancient wing called Archaeopteryx. This was discovered in the 1850s in a quarry in Germany. We have a replica of it in our museum. And now there's been 13 specimens found total. And yes, this is still a dinosaur, but it's shedding a lot of the carnivorous with features of this type of a dinosaur. When it will evolve into birds, and we can sit here for hours and talk about this, it will lose the bony tail, as you can see there, and it will lose the sharp teeth. And so they have a lot in common with dinosaurs. And now birds are actually in the dinosaur family. They're called avian dinosaurs. And they're called avian dinosaurs. And so when you see dinosaurs, you'll see them in your backyard flying around. So one of the things that we notice about these, hold on, let me see. My phone is pinging for some reason. I'm not sure why it's doing. I'm not sure why my phone is pinging. Okay, there we go. So these dinosaurs that fly around now have a lot in common with their ancestors. So all the traits that you see of dinosaurs today, they all came from these theropod dinosaurs. And matter of fact, when they did find a little bit of Tyrannosaurus DNA, they realized that, Tyrannosaurus is actually, an ancestor of birds. They're very much related. Its closest living relative is a chicken. So the furcula, the wishbone, birds, and Archaeopteryx have that. So does Microraptor and these theropod dinosaurs. The skull structure, the hollow bones, the limbs, the claws. And matter of fact, Dr. Horner, great paleontologist out of Montana, have been able to retro-engineer a chicken for it to grow carnivorous teeth. So whether you think that's a good idea or not, you can see that we have a lot of of pretty much direct evidence that the evolution of these birds that we love so much came from the dinosaur lineage. So in the group we have of archosaurs, we have basically crocodiliomorphs, we have dinosaurs, and we have birds. That's kind of what they call the clade, the big clade. So let's talk about Audubon. And I know Audubon was in Ohio, and he was in Florida as well. Traveled pretty much all over the Northeast. And he's got an incredible story. His story is amazing. And let's just clear one thing up real quick. As I said, a lot of people know of him, don't know a lot about him. He did not create that great highway in Germany called Audubon. And I'm just kidding. He didn't create that. I saw a great joke about that. But nor did he create, believe it or not, the Audubon Society. That came about 87 years later. But his legacy did create an incredible awareness for the environment worldwide, and it created the greatest environmental movement or society really in our history of the world. So he's an important figure, somewhat controversial now today when we look back on his life. And you could spend years just studying his biography. It's really quite amazing. So this is a monumental work. What he did is he created uh, bird portraiture, and he lifted it to a fine art because before then it was done all very, very scientific. And these prints, which are very, very rare, they're artifacts and they tell stories. They tell stories of him painting the birds. They tell stories of the science that he was doing. And of course, his monumental work was breaking the mold back then and putting them life size and putting them in action and in their real environments. And that had never been done before. So these paintings or these prints, they reflect change. And they reflect a big change that really kind of nobody really looked back at. People really paint the birds like they did before his time. But he wasn't the first ornithologist in America. But this monumental project took about 10 to 12 years. And if you purchased a subscription, because he sold them by subscription, some 200 roughly, it would take about 10 years to get your book. And so most people wouldn't spend $20,000 today on a book that might take you 10 years to get. So pretty an amazing accomplishment. So he created this census in North America, but not of its people, but of its avian residents. And he wanted to paint all the birds, but of course, that was in the thousands, and he wasn't going to be able to do that. But when he ended up doing his prints and his paintings, he did 435 plates, and it was called the Elephant Folio. And we'll get that here in a second. So if you wanted to buy one today, the prints are about 5,000 to, I'd say, about 250,000 today to buy a print, depending on its condition. Now you see the giant size of the book. That paper there is called the Elephant Folio. So it's really, really large. It was the largest commercial available paper at the time. If you wanted to buy a complete set of Audubon's, I think there's about 119 known. That would cost you about $12 million today. That was the last auction price around that for a complete set. Really quite amazing book. So there's the Elephant Folio. You can see the large size. The birds, of course, some of them are really big. So birds like the flamingo, he's going to drop it down and show it into a feeding position. And so this giant paper was really kind of new at the time. You could purchase it and you could fold it, you could cut it. But what was really important is that the watercolors that he used, and he's self-taught. He's a self-taught artist and a self-taught scientist. The watercolors actually would sit on top of the paper really, really well, this new elephant folio paper, and it didn't sink into the fibers. So that gives it great more color, contrast, and it gives you great more perspective as well. And that's one of the great beauties of this. So that paper was about 39 to 26 inches. And they were all made from engraved copper plates. Actually, his work today would just cost an amazing amount, paid in advance subscriptions, and nobody's really equaled this book before. This has basically not been equaled. It's a monumental piece of work. And so there's just a picture of it in the 2018 auction. I believe that's when it went at Christie's for about $10 million, which was a pretty amazing amount for his work. And I think you would probably, if you knew about this, you would be amazed at the kind of frenzy over his work. So this is interesting. This picture here is, it was so big that people actually had custom made furniture to house these giant books. With all now, sometimes people didn't bind them, so when you got it from the publisher, um, you would have them binded either by the publisher, or it was up to your responsibility to bind them. Some people just kept them loose. Sometimes people canceled their subscriptions and didn't get all of the prints. So Audubon, and we'll get a little bit into his earlier life here in a minute, but Audubon, you know, when he made these prints and he would send them to you and you purchased a subscription, you would get this wooden box and it was lined with tin. And when you got it, you got a set of 5. When you opened it up, he's a great marketer. The first 2 birds were big birds, like a flamingo or something like that. And then the next 2 were, mid-sized birds. And then like the next 3 were smaller birds. So when you open it up, you're like, oh, wow, it's incredible. Look at this. This is amazing. And so that's how he would keep people, interested in paying for their subscriptions. So, yeah, there's a piece of furniture that was made just to house Audubon's gigantic elephant folio, Birds of North America. There's another example right there. So there are 2 complete sets in the world that are in their original binding. That's it, just 2. And one is at the Smithsonian, the other one is at the Moscow Museum of Natural History in Russia. So he was born in Haiti, an illegitimate child. And his father was a sea captain. And he had a plantation, a sugar plantation on what we would call Haiti today, or Saint Dominique back then. It was the richest colony in the world. There was a chambermaid named Jean Rabin from Nantes came over. He got her pregnant, and the result is John James Audubon. He also had a half sister, but the uprising caused them to flee, and he went back to Nantes. And his mom passed away pretty early. Didn't live very long after he was born, and when he was about 11 years old, he ended up going back to France, where I guess you want to call it the Great Wife took him in as his own. He always loved birds, and he always loved art. He always drew all the time. And the first bird that he ever drew was the dove. And he would say to his father, Dad, I draw these birds, but I can't make them look like they're real, like they're lifelike. And his dad would tell him, son, only God can do that. No artist can replicate an animal and make it look alive. But a father and son relationship can be, contentious at times or prove dad wrong. And maybe he took that to heart and thought, I'm going to prove my dad wrong someday, and I'm going to make birds look very realistic. And so maybe he took that to heart. And he did. So he did prove his dad wrong. So because he was illegitimate, and most of that sugar production is now going to move over to the island of Cuba, because Haiti had the huge revolution. And But around 1800 or so, we get the Napoleonic Wars and we get Napoleon's grand army, and there's conscription going on. His dad had purchased a property in Pennsylvania called Mill Grove. There was a small lead mine on the property. His dad had an overseer. It's still there today. This was the house. It was built in 1762. And he decides to send his son, give him a fake passport, change his name around a little bit. And he tells John, hey, listen, kind of be vague about where you come from, because being illegitimate back then was a big deal. Uh, and so he comes to America through New York. He doesn't speak English, so he would introduce himself as I'm Audubon. And he comes to Mill Grove, and he starts to do bird experiments. He's drawing birds, but he also has his eye on the neighbor's daughter, Lucy Bakewell, and they eventually get married at age 20, and they're going to head off basically out to the frontier. But he was, running bird experiments even at Mill Grove. He's the first person that ever tagged birds and banded birds to find out if the same birds came back. So he was really kind of on the cutting edge. Um, his relationship with his dad is pretty interesting too, because his dad told him to be, hey, be kind of vague about where you come from. Kind of gave him the idea that he could maybe tell some stories. He's a little bit of maybe of a storyteller, and told some tales that may be half truths. So one of them was that his father was a war hero. Um, in the Revolutionary War, and that really wasn't really true. I forget what battle it was, but he would kind of make up some stories that historians today figured out they may not be that true. So he said his dad was actually a war hero at Valley Forge, which wasn't a battle; it was an encampment. So he marries Lucy Bakewell. She kind of long lives him in the end as well. There she is right there in her later years. They're going to move out to out west. So he also was a portrait artist. So a lot of people don't realize this. So he marries Lucy Bakewell. They get on a raft. They go down the Ohio River, and they move out to a town of 1,200 people that was kind of on the western frontier at the time, called Louisville. And he sets up shop in the dry goods store in Louisville. He also owns a grist mill in Henderson, Kentucky. And then at times he lives in New Orleans as well. And he still loves birds. He's drawing birds, painting birds, but he's mainly a watercolorist, a self-taught watercolor. And watercolor is very, very difficult. He did do oils. He never considered himself a good oil artist. So he's always very frustrated with that. But here he did paint portraits. And back then, in the style of portraits, there were a lot of painters going around America called limners, which were basically self-taught artists, and they would do portraits. And it was very common to do portraits of people who've passed away, or do somebody who was important. Children were important to be painted, and usually proportions weren't very good. You'll see like a big head, kind of small shoulders. A lot of times they didn't sign their artwork, not all the time. So he would travel throughout Louisiana and other places when he had troubles with money, and he would do portrait work. And he would charge anywhere between $5 and $25 for portraits. And he usually would just do them in the daytime for one day, and he would get it done. So a lot of them were chalk art, or like pencil sketches. So he was a pretty accomplished portrait artist, and that's how he would raise money in times of trouble. Because although he does become very successful with the birds of North America, it took a long time. So that's sort of what he was doing in order to raise a steady income. So when he does this book, he does a lot of work all throughout the eastern United States, including Florida, including Ohio and the Ohio River Valley. And one of the great birds that he did in the Ohio River Valley area was the great horned owl. And so this was something that he did when he visited, uh, areas in and around Cincinnati, the Ohio River Valley, sketching and observing birds in their natural habitats, a lot of woodlands. He stated that when he went down the Ohio River on his way out to Louisville, that it was the most beautiful river in the world. And it was flanked with incredible forests. The water was super clear. You can't, we have the same accounts here in Florida that the, Halifax River near us and this river and that river was super clear, full of fish that literally impeded your boat. But of course, those days are kind of gone. So here's the great horned owl, great predator. Its talons could be 8 inches across. It eats all types of rodents, small mammals, maybe some crustaceans as well. And of course, here he has it perched. So he's creating the bird's life size. And what he's going to do with all these bird portraits is he's going to do something completely different. He's going to show them in action. He's going to tell you a story. He's going to give you an experience, which nobody had done that in nature before. And so we have this in our collection. It's in the exhibit, the great horned owl. And we love this portrait. We're very happy to have, one of 200. So please remember, these are one of 200 prints. Now, all these prints are hand painted. So yes, they're prints, but they're also in a way an original piece of artwork because they are all hand printed. So they are all slightly different. Now, when you collect Audubons, you got to be careful because some have not been taken care of. They might have small rips, they might have stains, they may have fading because they weren't in museum quality reflective glass or UV glass. So if you go through our tour, the wild turkey. So in our collection, we have birds, very few birds that are just specific to Florida because there aren't that many. But in our collection are birds of Florida, and a lot of them are all over. But if they're in Florida at some point, they're in the collection. Of course, he had a lot of experience with the wild turkey because he traveled by foot a lot out there on the frontier, and he painted this in Ohio. So he loved the turkey. He thought the turkey was great. I know that when I see this in the exhibit and I see it, I'm like, that's a delicious bird. He did eat almost all of the birds that he collected. So one of the things that makes him controversial as well is that he would shoot up to 100 to 200 birds a day. Now, that's not uncommon. Everybody hunted back then. Everybody ate songbirds, and birds were part of a huge part of the diet for people. So there was some people might say, well, that's terrible that he was shooting 100 to 200 birds. He had no field glasses. There were no museum collections. There were no field guides, anything like that. No binoculars. So it was very common to shoot the birds. Even today, ornithologists who are serious scientists will actually shoot birds to collect it. So it's still actually practiced today, but not on the wholesale slaughter that you would see that was going on the frontier. And Audubon himself said there's a wholesale slaughter going on of these birds. And he was starting to raise concerns that birds were getting, certain species were getting wiped out. So certainly in his travels, thousands of miles on foot, he came across the wild turkey a lot. And here's the turkey, Tom. So when you open up that huge book, it's a huge bird. This is the first plate. This is the first one you would see. So it's very, very impressive. And he shows, this is basically an upland bird. You'll see it in orchids, orchards. You'll see it in prairies, in fields, and sometimes in marshes as well. At marshes as well. Now, in Florida here, growing up, I never saw them that much. They've made a pretty good comeback here in Florida. I live in a small town called DeLand, which is between Daytona Beach and Orlando. And we see them quite a lot now, which is a really good sign. So some birds have made a really great comeback because Florida was a place that's been devastated by, loss of habitat, plume hunting, 120 years ago. So the wild turkey, This is a bird that, 24 pounds is the male, kind of a very showy bird, got the classic gobble, kind of gregarious, and it can fly, but it flies low to the ground and up on perches. So at night, it would go up into the perches. And of course, there's the one that he painted from the Ohio River Valley area. The passenger pigeon is another bird that he painted up in Ohio. Painted a lot of birds up in Ohio area, but passenger pigeon is one that's really important because this bird was known by the billions, estimated to be 3 billion in his time period. And he was giving concerns about this bird. And then in a short time period, it does come to north central Florida. And he would say that sometimes, now I don't know if this is an exaggeration because, as I said, sometimes he could make up some stories. He would say that passenger pigeon flocks would fly over him and they would take 3 days to go by. And then it would dot out the sun like an eclipse. These birds, though, were in massive flocks and they were hunted to extinction in about a 20-year time period. And businesses were created just to commercial business just to harvest these birds. And they were so thick that literally they had nets. You could throw nets on them. You could knock them down with sticks. And then the last one that was alive was in captivity in a zoo in Cincinnati, and it died in 1916. So other people said too, there's lots of accounts that these birds would literally blacken the sky. And they would go on for hours and hours and hours, and the flocks would be miles and miles long. So unfortunate we don't have that today. So this was a great warning sign. This is in our collection, and it's in our last gallery. We have 5 galleries that are part of this exhibition, and this is in the conservation gallery. We have a whole conservation gallery, and this is the one that represents the extinction. Of course, we still have a lot of birds today that are, in a lot of trouble. There's kind of a close-up view showing them in action, showing perched on a branch. One of his background painters was a young boy about 12, 13 years old named Mason. And Mason, George Mason, he was one of his background painters that he taught art to, and he took him up and down the Mississippi, and he was doing florals, and he was really good at doing florals. So he didn't do the backgrounds, but he mainly would do the birds. So Audubon would be up very early in the morning, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, breakfast, getting the guns ready. Then out by 6 o'clock, he's out hunting birds, comes back for lunch. Then he's painting and drawing. Sometimes he's back out on the hunt again later. And then at night he's writing. So he writes about all these birds, and he always said that these birds that he sees, there's no position or there's nothing that people say, oh, they can't do that. He's like, oh, I've seen them do that. So it's pretty amazing. When he comes to Florida, he is told by Bartram that Florida is an Eden. And when he comes to Florida, he comes to what we call the oldest city in North America today, St. Augustine. And he's not quite famous yet. Now, he does spend a lot of time in New Orleans doing portraits, birds, and he'll come to Florida, and he's going to come twice. When he comes to Florida the first time, he hates Florida. Really, he just can't stand it. So how did he get this idea to go full time and do birds? When he's in Louisville, he's got this dry goods store. There was a prior ornithologist named Alexander Wilson. And Alexander Wilson was from Scotland. And he comes over to the United States, becomes a naturalized citizen, and he becomes interested in birds. And before this grand style, this lifting up of bird portraiture to a fine art, birds were painted very scientifically, usually in profile and very stiff. And sometimes there might be 8 species on a page, and they're not life size. And this was the style of doing natural history portraiture of, animals and birds. They weren't done to life size. But Audubon's going to break that mold. But Alexander Wilson is like kind of our first, ornithologist. And, he does the ornithology of North America. And back then, as I said, this style, small paper, maybe a couple bird species on one, he gets published in Philadelphia, and Boston, New York, especially Philadelphia was like the hub of science. And the Academy of Sciences in Philadelphia published uh, Alexander Wilson's book, which was the first book. Before that, mostly it was Europeans coming over here, describing our animals and birds and getting all the credit. But now we got this guy, Alexander Wilson, who's doing it. He's discovering new species. And we finally have our own guy who's discovering new species. And so he's kind of a hero. And so one day in Louisville, it's quite an amazing story. Alexander Wilson is out in Louisville, and he may have been tipped off that, hey, there's a guy out in Louisville. Maybe he'll buy a subscription to your book, Alexander, because he sold his book by subscription as well. And so what do you think? One day, all of a sudden, Alexander Wilson comes in to the dry goods store and shows Audubon this book. He doesn't know exactly who he is. And we think that maybe he was tipped off that there's a guy who loves birds out there. And Audubon is just like, wow, this is amazing. Look at this book's amazing. I love this. And he's like, you sell it by subscription? Audubon says, I'm going to buy a subscription. It's out his checkbook. Well, his partner, who he grew up with in France, comes out and says, hey, what's going on out here? He goes, well, this is Alexander Wilson, and he's an ornithologist, and I'm going to buy his book. And his partner looks at the artwork and the book, goes, hey, John, I hate to say this, but your artwork's a lot better. You got to think about Alexander Wilson at the time. I go, whoa, what's going on here, man? What's going on? You paint birds? You do birds? And Audubon goes, yes, I do. And Alexander is like, well, can I see your birds? And he pulls out this huge, folio. He opens it up and shows him the peregrine falcon, could go at like 200 miles an hour, crash dives on impact, and it kills birds immediately, blood everywhere. And Alexander is like, wow, he's kind of taken aback by this. And so Audubon does not buy the subscription, but the bell went off. The spark went off in his mind that, hey, I can do this. And this is where he gets the idea to go on this entrepreneurial venture to paint all the birds of North America and sell it by subscription. So what he does is he goes to Philadelphia, but when he had gone out to the frontier, he donned on all the frontier clothes, buckskin suit, raccoon hat, moccasins, Bowie knife, all that stuff. He goes to Philadelphia dressed like that and goes to the academy. He meets with a guy named George Ord. Now remember, this academy, they published Wilson. They love Wilson. And they see this guy as kind of a buffoon. He's dressed like a frontiersman. He's over the top. He's bombastic. And Audubon is really rejected there. He's rejected by a lot of the folks there because they're protecting Wilson, because that's their guy. And so he doesn't find any support there. But there were some folks in Philadelphia that said, hey, John, Audubon, your work's really, really good. You could probably find some serious support over in Europe. Because in Europe, they were craving things and information about life and the natural history of North America and in America. And so he's going to go over to England and to Liverpool, sail over, and he's kind of greeted as a hero. And they love the frontier outfit. And they love his artwork. And he finds a huge audience over in Europe. And that's where he ends up selling most of his subscriptions. So they set up a museum show, And the first day, 400 people come. People are lined up around the blocks to see, hey, whoa, these are birds from North America. Pretty amazing. So he comes to Florida. If you see in the picture at the top left, that's the big fort in St. Augustine. And he hates St. Augustine. He hates Florida. It's nothing but alligators, mosquitoes. It's cold one day. It's hot the next day. His socks are wet. His dog Plato, his hunting dog, he won't even bring out with him because of the alligators. But when he does come to Florida, he will paint 52 new birds to him. And a lot of these are iconic birds that people really know all over the world, like the flamingo and the roseate spoonbill, the a whole bunch of herons and things like that. So he travels through Florida, and he travel by pony. He'll travel by schooner. He'll travel on foot, canoe, you name it. So on the top right here, we see these ruins. These were slave plantations that he would stay at in Northeast Florida. They were all burned in the Second Seminole War after he left, and he was selling subscriptions in Florida and trying to discover this Eden that he thought was Florida. So all four of these locations that you see here, St. Augustine with the big tree in the front, a little bit south is a slave plantation called Bulow with the tall pillars there. And then these ruins down here is an archaeological site, and then a spring here over where I live in the western part of Volusia County. So he traveled all through Florida, Northeast Florida, quite a bit, but didn't like it. Thought it was really a difficult place. He's going to come back a second time, and then that time he comes back. So this was a Bulow plantation. This is one of the hardest prints to find. In the background is the slave plantation called Bulow or Bulowville, and it's the only known picture of this slave plantation is in the back. We could not secure this image for our show, which was really important because for us, it has a very local history to it. There's the wild turkey. As I said, there's a picture of it just kind of hanging in a natural pose with its head held high. That's in our exhibit as well. Here's the bald eagle that he painted, also very early in our gallery. And this is a great example of him showing you an experience, which had really never been done before. The eagle's life size. But here's the incredible thing. He's giving these birds and these animals emotions, almost human-like emotions, but without losing the look of the animal, without losing the scientific look of the animal. If you could ever see this up close, you see the ferocity in the face of this eagle and the anguish of this poor catfish, of this dinosaur, if you want to call it, or bald eagle, who's basically sitting on top of it with his talons and ripping it apart, or going to rip it apart. So he's giving people an experience which they'd never really had before. And he didn't like the eagle that much. He said it had a nasty temper. It was like a piratical bird. It killed other birds. He loved the osprey. That was a bird that he loved a whole bit. Here's a little bit of storytelling. Audubon here is showing you his ability to storytell with the mockingbird. It's the state bird of 5 other states. It's our state bird here in Florida. And he had a lot of critics about this one because the rattlesnake is climbing up a tree, and he got criticized because rattlesnakes don't climb trees and they don't have recurved fangs. And Audubon said, well, yes, they do. And actually, he is right. They can climb small trees and shrubs. They're not going to climb like a giant oak tree or something like that. And then you see the mockingbirds in action, this huge action scene here with them defending the nest. And the recurved fangs, they do have recurved fangs, but he took a lot of artistic license with this and exaggerated them. So they do have recurved fangs. And he was very well versed with rattlesnakes. I mean, this is a frontier guy. He's all over the place, thousands of miles. He saw rattlesnakes all the time. He saw turkeys all the time. He saw these birds. He would spend days observing just one species and writing about it and taking notes and taking his own field notes. So this was a very kind of interesting piece. Storytelling, controversial, pretty great piece. This is also very iconic Audubon, which is the brown pelican. The brown pelican is a constant resident here in Florida. And when I was a kid growing up in Miami, you didn't see a lot of pelicans in the early 70s. They were really pretty heavily endangered. They've made a great comeback. It's a great success story. Kind of a lazy bird. They do dive down, into the ocean to get fish. And he painted this pelican, I believe, in the Florida Keys. He wanted to paint one here where I live, down here in Daytona area, and he shot a bunch of them on an excursion when he was at this place called Bulowville, but he didn't get the specimen that he liked. So really an incredible story as well. Here's the white pelican, which you will see way up there in the Midwest and around the Great Lakes. And they do come down to Florida. They're probably still here. It's been a little colder than usual. And they're not that common to see down here. You'll see them once in a while. But here's another justification, because it's a huge bird, to show you that why he needed that giant paper, the elephant folio paper, which was the largest commercial paper at the time. This was a pelican in the mate. You see the little nodule on the bill there that grows during mating season, and then after mating season is over, it will fall off. They, unlike the brown pelican where it dives or it gets fed off of a dock, which is pretty common here, they get lazy. But this bird will be in a group, and they'll make either a straight line or a semicircle, and they'll bring all the fish to them. Here is the sooty tern, which he painted down in the Keys, the Florida Keys. If you've ever been to the Florida Keys, fantastic place. Practically grew up there as well. I lived in the south part of Miami, went down to the Keys a lot. It's a great place for birding, and the Everglades as well. So if you've never been to the Florida Keys, the Everglades, it's definitely something you got to do, because it's really, really amazing. So he painted this on these islands about 70 miles due west of Key West, not south, because that would put you in waters just off of Havana. So due west of Key West was the dry tortugas. And so dry, I mean, no fresh water, tortugas, turtles, discovered by Ponce de Leon. And he painted this bird. This is a pelagic bird, so it spends most of its life at sea. It would come to the dry tortugas to lay eggs by the millions. Audubon had commented that egg hunters from Havana would come over and just pick them up by the thousands and take them back to Havana, because they were highly sought after and were a special cuisine in Havana. So he commented about that. Now, when he was down in the Keys, it's pretty interesting. He hooked up with wreckers. So we have all those reefs off of Florida. And so the wreckers were sort of like these licensed pirates in a way. Florida's got a long history of pirates. And so these boats kind of would wreck on the reefs, and the wreckers would go out there and say, we're not going to kill you, but we're going to keep you safe, take you back to Key West, get you in a nice hotel, but we're going to kind of take everything off the ship, and it's going to be ours, and we're going to take it back to the customs house, pay a tax on it, and sell it. So the wreckers kind of liked it when ships wrecked on the reefs, because it was sort of like booty for them, but they weren't pirates, and they were going to go out there and kill you, and sink your boat, set on fire, steal your boat. They were out there to rescue you, take you there, but it was, shady. Until the lighthouses came in, then that kind of ended their careers. So here's where he painted the sooty tern. There's the dry tortugas. I've been out there once. It's the second least visited national park in the United States. There's a giant fort out there called Fort Jefferson. It was a Union fort, never was in a battle at all. That fort was not there when Audubon was there. The wreckers were important to him because the wreckers had a lot of knowledge about inlets and coves and where all types of flocks of birds were. So that was really important to him. So I have a boat on the biggest river here in Florida called the St. Johns River. And this was the limpkin. And it makes a horrible crying sound, and it almost went extinct, but it's back. It made a great comeback. Now, this artist who did the background was given instructions to paint the limpkin and paint like a tropical background, but somehow he painted some like weird Martian landscape in the background and didn't do a very accurate job. So he didn't do the landscapes. He painted mainly the birds. So what he would do is he would taxidermy these birds, which he was self-taught. He would wire them and then use a grid system to paint them. That's how he do it. So he would do an original watercolor. The watercolor would, go to the printer and then be etched. So you have to have an etcher who's just as good. This was done by a company in England called Havel and Sons. And then it would be inked, the plate, a black and white would come out, and then it would be hand colored by usually art students, and most of them were women. And so your job was, as one of these hand colorists, to just paint that one color in that one section and then hand it down the line. And if you took artistic license, you were fired. You had to paint it exactly the best way you could. So with about 200 subscriptions, 435 plates, you're talking about 78,000 hand color prints were made in the entire lifetime of Audubon. And he became very wealthy off of this. There's an image of St. Augustine. If you've ever been to St. Augustine, there's a black and white wood engraving. This is a wood engraving. But engraving was really important to this process. They were done on a copper. About 78 copper plates, original ones, survive today. His wife, Lucy Bakewell, fell into financial problems. She sold all the original watercolors to the New York Historical Society, and she sold most of the copper plates to the Phelps Dodge Corporation. As I again told you, here is the Carolina parakeet, which we just talked about earlier, and the passenger pigeon. That steep decline happened in the 1870s. And then here's this pair that he's showing here with a bright plumage. I do have a picture. There's the one in captivity at the zoo in Cincinnati, and I think it died in 1916. And then, of course, here's an artist rendition of the flocks of the passenger pigeon, kind of getting back to the passenger pigeon. The plumes. So plume hunting was devastating birds, especially here in the Everglades. And so women would wear these fancy hats. You can see one here at another museum, not our museum, down at the very tip of Florida in a town called Flamingo. And so it was Teddy Roosevelt and women who saved the birds in the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1900, 1900 to 1920, the Progressive Era. We get women's lives are changing and they're getting more civically involved. They're being more educated. And one of the things they get involved in is environmental movements. And in Florida, the Federation of Florida's women's clubs, they got together and they said, we're going to stop this wholesale slaughter of these birds, these wading birds, these incredible birds in the Everglades. And one of them that was getting devastated, were these incredible feathery birds like blue herons. It was just devastating. And I don't even really think they've come back today. It was Teddy Roosevelt who came up with the Lacey Act, 1900, that gave criminal punishment to plume hunters. And it took a long time and enforcement to have this conservation movement get underway. At one point, plumes were worth more than an ounce of gold. So these women in these clubs were going around literally ripping hats off of women, even if they were pinned, to try to save them and get this word out that this is a bad idea. There's the one at that museum, this Victorian style hat. So the Gilded Age was really important. America's changing very quickly. The Industrial Revolution or Victorian times. And I said, women are going to college. They're becoming educated, having less children, and they're getting civically involved. That's going to lead to the right to vote. And this is a guy in Florida who was a plume hunter named Guy Bradley. And Guy Bradley lived at the very tip of Florida. My last slide here. And as I said, we could talk for days on Audubon. So Guy Bradley was to go around the Everglades and tell people that you cannot hunt these birds anymore. This industry is over. This millinery industry is over. And what ends up happening is he leaves a small little frontier town in around 1900, 1904 in Flamingo, tiny little town. They're running, bootleg in there. It's just tiny. There's only like 200 people live there. He lives there, and he goes out and he hears shots fired on a Sunday morning, and he sees a schooner there, and he sees a guy named Walter Smith. He's arrested him before for plume hunting. Walter Smith was a Confederate, and he was a marksman in the Confederacy. And so he told Guy Bradley, if you come closer to my schooner, I'm going to shoot you. And he shoot, and Guy says, no, I'm coming to arrest you because you know this is illegal. I've told you this, and I'm going to arrest you. I see the birds, the dead birds on your boat, and I see you holding dead birds. I'm going to arrest you and your son. He goes, don't come any closer. Pulls up his rifle, and he blasts poor Guy Bradley away, shoots him dead. He floats around in the bay for 10 days before they find his body. Walter Smith goes home to his wife, says, I'm going to Key West. I'm going to turn myself in. I just killed Guy Bradley, who was, he's a warden now. He's a game warden. He's an officer. Goes down to Key West. He's got connections in Key West. Knows the judge, and we're talking about frontier justice here and frontier judges, and basically says, well, nobody really knows how Guy Bradley died, so you're innocent. And so Walter Smith goes unpunished. It was an outrage, actually made national news back then. And Guy Bradley's family went down and burned down everything that the Smith family owned because they all lived in the same town. So there is Lucy Bakewell. He had two sons, Victor and John Woodhouse. And they actually helped. When they got older, they helped with the book. Now, what happened to Audubon in the end? So what did he die of? He died at 65 years old. He had a house on the Hudson River in New York. He's buried up there in New York. So this is what we think now is that he had lost his mind. Because he worked in taxidermy, he was around all types of harsh chemicals. He was around, formaldehyde, whatever it was, a lot of mercury. He was around a lot of mercury and lead. And we now believe, a lot of historians believe, that he died of Mad Hatter's disease because they said he had lost his mind. There is a photograph of him that is a daguerreotype of Audubon in much older age. If you want to, you can go online and see that. Well, we're just about out of time. And I hope you enjoyed the talk. We could probably go on for more days and talk about his travels, but it's a hard thing to do in about 50 minutes. So I'll take any questions or comments.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much for highlighting some of the birds in Ohio and making our presentation kind of geared to some of the species we are more aware of here in Ohio.
Yeah, we were doing Ohio and Florida, so
Yeah, that
in
was
between, but just Ohio and Florida.
that was great. We do have a couple questions from the audience. I was wondering, first of all, now I know you don't work specifically in conservation, but what are some of the efforts of the conservation team at the museum to kind of maintain the longevity of the paper prints?
Okay, that's a great question. So what we do, so when we got all these prints, like all 92 of them, they were unframed. So we had custom frames made for every one. They had to be on, acid free, and then they had to have museum conservation glass. So every piece of glass and all the frames had to be basically custom made because some of them were just slightly different sizes, just very slightly different. I mean, so we had framers from Orlando come in and we set up shop in our back room in our in our storage room, and they would come once a week starting about 6 or 7 months in advance, and they would come take the measurements and they would cut the glass, the frames. Our frames are all identical. They're gilt gold, and that's how we did it. And then the lighting is very specific. You have to have low lighting. So at the New York Historical Society, when they had the original paintings in prints, they only show a few at a time because they can't be out for long periods of time. So the exhibit ends in about 3 weeks, and they will go back into dark storage for a while. And then we'll probably rotate some out because you just can't have them sitting out because they will fade. Even with that glass, they'll fade over time.
Yeah,
So they need to be kind of in a dark storage up on these huge racks that we have. And they're big, so they take up a lot of space.
I
So
bet.
they can be cleaned and restored as well. So
Hmm. All right, so we'll take some of our audience questions. Um, one of our patrons said she had visited the Audubon site in the Florida Keys a few years ago and wondered if they were at all affiliated with the Museum of Arts and Sciences.
So you're talking about the Audubon house. So when Audubon went to the Florida Keys on his second trip, he was already kind of famous now. Interesting little side story. He was scared of, yellow fever and malaria, so he never slept on the island. He slept on the ship called the Marion, the Coast Guard cutter Marion. Um, and they have a collection of the reprints called the Octavos of all the Florida birds, and those are very, very small. But he never actually stayed in that house. They just built that house and called it the Audubon House because there's like an Audubon museum. It is not associated with us, that museum though, that historic house down there in Key West. So you ever get to go to Key West, it's a pretty cool place.
I bet. Have you actually been to the Smithsonian to see the birds of North America, like in person?
No, I haven't. So
Okay.
here's what I did do. I did go on a training program up there, and we went to the Bird Strike Laboratory, and they said, "Well, we're going to take you to the Strike Laboratory." I'm like, what's that mean?" And they're like, "Well, we have this laboratory where when birds get hit by planes, they go to this lab and we study and research the birds because they're trying to figure out, they don't want birds to be hitting these planes." And so, Sully, got hit by like, Canadian geese, sucked up like 9 or 10 Canadian geese into those engines, and he landed that plane. They got those birds there. And then I was asking them, it's incredible. I mean, you go into this upstairs room and there's thousands, I mean, hundreds of thousands of birds, preserved there. And then I said, "Hey, we've got Audubon prints, from Florida." And he goes, "Oh," they open up the door and these are the actual stuffed bird, the taxidermy birds of Audubon. And it's pretty amazing. But I didn't get to see a lot of those prints, of the original prints there. But we've had some of them in a previous collection at the museum as well. We actually have about 150 prints, but those are from an older collection and they're not as good. So we actually have 2 flamingo prints of the famous flamingo with the head
Mhm.
dripping down like that. And one looks like maybe it had been restored and painted over, and it's a lot brighter and crisper. We didn't use that one. We used the one that was a little slightly fader because we realized that had been touched up. That's what
Yeah.
I think.
Well, one of the patrons asked where in the Smithsonian would they actually see the book. So if you haven't been there, I don't know if anyone else has maybe been to the Smithsonian that could chime in, but I'm sure you could probably find it online. I know a lot of their collection is digitized.
I doubt they have the original book out on display.
Yeah.
Bring it out from time to time, usually probably on some type of anniversary, they might. Um, and unfortunately he's been kind of come controversial the last couple of years because he had
Yeah.
slaves. And at times he was a good businessman when he paid attention to his businesses. At times when he got enthralled with birds, he didn't pay any attention. He went bankrupt, was in debtor's prison. Um, and so he had a lot of financial troubles for a very long time, believe it or not, and until this book really took off, this Birds of North America. Then he finally became very, very wealthy. But in the end, they went bankrupt. So Lucy did. So
I'm going to just put a link in the chat. I was reading on the Museum of Arts and Sciences website about the exhibit that you guys have going on now through April 6th. So in case you have a chance to get down to Florida, you still have a little bit of time to see it. But you guys had a lot of really good information about the controversies surrounding Audubon. And I know I was reading a little bit about the Audubon Society considering changing their name of the society because of his controversy with slavery. But I'm going to just put the link in the chat. If you
yeah,
want to read more about it, you can.
yeah, we wanted to address that in the exhibit as well.
Mhm.
We want to, shove that under the rug. He wasn't a perfect person. And yeah, so we do address that. And that's up to those societies if they want to change the name. I think some will do it. And I know some have already done it. I don't know if
Mhm.
all of them are going to do it, but I know some
Mhm.
have done it. So they've changed the name. So
Nancy asked, if you know, what is the most expensive singular bird print at the moment?
that's a good question. I would probably think it would probably be the flamingo would probably be one of them. Maybe the turkey, if you can get it in grade. It depends also on the grade level, A, B, C, D. You know, that would be really, really important as well. And I wanted to show you something real quick. This is the Temple Newsom Estate in the city of Leeds. And this lady, because we're running a little bit out of time, she had bought a subscription and she cut them all up and made wallpaper out of the original Audubon prints in the city of Leeds in England. And she obviously had no idea how much they were going to be worth down the road. And there's the estate. It's the Temple Newsom Estate. So there's one room where the wallpaper is all original Audubon prints.
Wow. That would be phenomenal to
Yeah,
see.
yeah, that's pretty interesting. So if you're ever in England and you want to go see that in the city of Leeds, you can go to the wallpaper room with Audubon prints originals.
All right, I'll just put there's a comment in our chat, but it might be of interest to our Hudson community since this is a little more local to us. Heather said that the Cleveland Museum of Natural History has a double elephant folio in their collection, which would be pretty cool to see. So I'll put her link in the chat there.
Yeah, there's
Um,
about 119 complete sets, believe it or not, roughly. Um,
yeah,
uh,
so
I'm not sure every museum that has one. We don't.
yeah,
So when we don't have a complete set, but
yeah.
yeah.
But Heather, thanks for sharing that because if you want to get just a perspective of how big these prints actually are, at least our Natural History Museum up in Cleveland has something similar that you can kind of get just that perspective.
Are they on this?
And
Are
then
some of them on display? Do you know?
I don't know offhand. I haven't been there in a little while. If anyone local has, but it's so nice because a lot of museums have a lot of their collections digitized that you can see stuff
Yes.
now without even having to go there.
Especially the Smithsonian.
Yeah,
They've done an amazing job of digitizing just millions of things of
yeah.
objects and artwork, etc.
Well, I'll end our program today with a comment from our patron, Zach. You're a great storyteller, excellent presentation, and beautiful images. So thank you so much for joining
Thank
us
you. And oh, by
and
the way,
sharing all about the Audubon, local history as well as your Florida history. We really
great.
appreciate your time.
Thank you. And by the way, my half side of my family originated out of Cleveland, Ohio,
Oh,
and they moved to Miami in the 1930s.
oh,
So I'm very honored to be able to do this and hopefully have me back down the road again. So,
absolutely.
a
Well,
lot of topics.
everyone,
I've been doing this for 31 years. So
yeah. So
really
you've definitely
kindly.
got a wealth of knowledge on many different topics.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Enjoy the sunshine today.
Yes, stay warm.
We will. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye bye.